So in this lesson, we're going to talk a bit about how to build and maintain a vendor relationship and the type of vendor relationships that exist. Now, for most organizations, we can categorize the vendors into one of three categories. So either a strategic vendor, a preferred vendor, or a transactional vendor. And so here's some of the differences between them. So strategic vendor, of course, is the group of vendors that are most important in an organization, where they're supplying some kind of an essential service or some essential system or system component that cannot be easily replaced, and the relationship, of course, is long-term and it's more of a partnership. Now, that's in contrast to a preferred vendor relationship where the vendor is very important to the organization, but it could be replaced. The vendor could be replaced with an alternate vendor. It might be difficult, but it's possible. And then finally, we have transactional vendors and a transactional vendor relationship that is not critical to the organization. There are many alternatives for a particular vendor, for example, purchasing office items or purchasing certain types of IDEs or databases. You can easily find another vendor. It might be difficult to do, but it doesn't take a tremendous amount of effort. Now, in addition to categorizing our vendors, we can also categorize the relationships, and there is sort of four overall types of relationships that we can distinguish between that an organization might have with a vendor. There is two types of what we might call win-win relationships. There is one where we can classify that as a win-lose relationship, and one that is unfortunately a lose-lose relationship. So the win-win relationship types are the cooperative relationship type and the collaborative. Win-lose includes a competitive relationship type, and then of course, unfortunately, there is actually a counterproductive vendor relationship type as well. So let's go take a closer look at each one of these and figure out what precisely makes a relationship cooperative versus collaborative, competitive versus perhaps even counterproductive. So the best type of relationship to have is a cooperative relationship. In that type of relationship, both parties, the organization and the vendor, recognize that they can get from the relationship what they want, that a long-term relationship is beneficial to both parties. That means the vendor and the buyer, the organization that buys services or components or systems or platforms, they cooperate, but they do not form a strong collaborative partnership. Now, vendors may often operate amongst themselves on a project to suit a buyer's need for a single source vendor. Another form of a win-win relationship type is a collaborative relationship. It's probably even a little bit better than a cooperative relationship because in that you have true teamwork. It's a relationship that's characterized by teamwork amongst the vendors, between the organization and the vendors, both parties, all the parties involved, if it's multiple vendors in the relationship, they realize they all benefit from each other and by being in that collaborative relationship. Now, that's typically the type of relationship that an organization wants to pursue if it wishes to foster a long-term partnership with a vendor that benefits the organization, perhaps strategically, and you want to make sure, of course, that the vendor does not go out of business, that all the vendors play nicely together, and that the relationship is mutually beneficial for all the parties over the long term. So clearly, collaborative and cooperative relationship are a win-win type of relationship because both parties get out of the relationship a significant benefit. Now, there are, of course, other types of relationships too that may not necessarily be beneficial to both parties. One of them is a competitive relationship type where both parties look out for what is best for them, regardless of the impact on any future transactions between the parties. In other words, you want to basically get the best deal you can now, which may impede more deals in the future. For example, if you really beat up a vendor over price, they may acquiesce because they need a particular project for cash flow reasons, or the one to work with you because you're a marquee client and it could help their image, they might acquiesce to a lower price. They might even acquiesce to a situation where they might lose money on a deal and on selling your product or providing a service, but they're not going to be very keen on repeating that. And you might then say, well, if I can't get it in the future for that same price, I'm just going to move on to a different vendor. So essentially, you are looking to win in that relationship. And unfortunately, often in that case, the vendor loses. Or the other way around, that the vendor might gouge you for a price because the vendor might know that you don't have an alternative. And in that case, the vendor wants to win regardless of potential for future work with an organization. And the organization then, of course, is the loser in that relationship. Essentially, neither party looks for benefits in the transaction for the other party. So the buyer basically presumes that the vendor can be replaced by another vendor in the future, and both parties are looking to win regardless of the cost to the other party. Now, of course, naturally, this is not terribly cost efficient in most cases. It can also be pretty detrimental to the long-term health of both the vendor and the organization. And generally, you want to avoid that type of relationship if you are seeking a long-term partnership. Clearly, this would not be a strategic type of partnership. This is much more a transactional type of engagement with a vendor. There are even counterproductive relationships where, of course, neither party starts out collaborating. They both are in a competitive relationship. They both want to win. But in this particular case, the organization might even change terms throughout the contract. The vendor might not stick up to their particular agreement. They both are basically looking to spend the least amount of money. The organization might even not pay the vendor at the end, looking for an excuse not to pay. Essentially, in this relationship, both parties simply want to win. They don't care about what happens to the other party. There is no supportive partnership with the vendor and buyer. There is no long-term relationship that's possible. It is purely transactional. Either party or both parties looking out for just what's in their best interest. And it really becomes counterproductive because neither party might achieve its long-term goals. One party is going to lose out because they're never going to get repeat business. They might not get a recommendation. They might get a bad reputation in the marketplace. The organization engages the vendor, might never want to work with the vendor again. Again, they might also get a bad reputation, so no other vendor might want to work with them in the future. Employees might feel that they're committing a breach of ethics and act in an immoral manner. It really ends up being a type of relationship that you want to avoid at all costs. So that really means that you want to look for win-win where both the vendor and the organization have a long-term interest in continuing the partnership. You want to look for a vendor relationship that is cooperative and collaborative rather than competitive or even counterproductive. So naturally, you want collaborative relationships with your strategic vendors. You might be okay with having either collaborative or cooperative relationships with your preferred vendors. One could argue that even for transactional vendors, you try to want to be cooperative and not necessarily be competitive. There might be some managers and some executives who might be okay with having a competitive relationship with a vendor when they're dealing with transactional vendors, but still in the long term, this could be pretty detrimental to the reputation of the organization. One has to always remember that vendors do talk amongst themselves. Employees of vendors do move between vendors, and reputation of an organization and their clients goes with them. So when you stiff a vendor, when you treat a vendor and have a win-lose relationship, when you beat up a vendor price-wise, you don't pay your bills, or you don't work well with a vendor, well, news travels, and it could be that you're in a situation that no vendor wants to work with you. And of course, the other way around, an organization might be in a situation where no vendor wants to work with the organization. could just simply be that they just don't want to be associated with that particular organization, and that some organizations might not want to be engaged with a certain vendor. Again, remember that organizations amongst themselves talk to each other. They go to common events, common conferences. A lot of times the CEOs and the managers might be in industry boards, groups, nonprofits. They might serve on faculties of local universities. Everybody talks amongst one another. The particular industries don't tend to be that big that there is an insulation of a poor vendor-organization relationship. News travels, and you want to avoid, even in transactional vendor or with transactional vendors, a competitive or a counterproductive relationship. So to summarize, vendor relationships can be segmented into 4 types: collaborative, cooperative, competitive, and counterproductive. And that you should strive to only start and build collaborative and cooperative relationships that offer a win-win proposition to both parties.